Having debuted at London's Earls Court 1 week earlier, the 2009 Top Gear live tour rolled into Birmingham, opening with the usual grand entrance, this time in a trio of sports cars as opposed to some older BMW Roadsters. Just before the show got underway proper, Richard Hammond has a rather victorious announcement to make.
Fifth Gear, Channel 5's motoring programme, not coming back to our screens.
It's over. It's been cancelled, and we thought it appropriate, before we get going, to just take a moment to reflect on Fifth Gear's achievements over the years. Okay,
Of course, this was merely some good-natured ribbing spoken entirely in jest, given that Fifth Gear frontman Tiff Needell was only a handful of metres away revving up sports cars as part of the pre-show entertainment, with Channel 5 eventually backtracking and deciding to renew the show for 2 more years. Onto the main event itself, the 09 World Tour marked a major shift from previous years. Whereas earlier shows held under the miles per hour live moniker were modest and much more understated affairs, starting from 2008, the BBC saw potential in branding these events as Top Gear Live in return for a slice of the pie, and committed towards publicising the events as much as possible. New acts debuted in 2009 would end up becoming future tour staples, such as a pre-show performance from fire dancer Naomi Lynch of the Lynch Pop dynasty, her flamethrower and a pair of fireproofed Subarus. And for the first time since 2003, there would also be a Reliant Robin race. Audience participation would also be ramped up with the return of an interactive reasonably priced car game, using a system of infrared cards and the audience's own yelling to steer the show's Lassetti around a virtualised Top Gear test track. The annual car football games would also see the introduction of national teams, adding a uniquely local flair to each tour stop. The Birmingham leg would end up running for 4 days until the 15th of November, coinciding with the TV broadcast of the Romanian road trip, for which the audience was shown a couple of hilarious holiday snaps.
so ladies and gentlemen, I found this. Captain Backdoor, as you say.
The tour would then take a 2-week hiatus in order for the team to regroup and film their obligations for TV, before heading back down to Dunsfold on Wednesday the 18th for their next studio taping. The second episode of Top Gear's 14th series aired on the 22nd of November 2009. Its production code was ENAA762L, and its official runtime is 1 hour, 1 minute, and 10 seconds, regardless of which version you choose to watch, with no cuts made to this episode either, outside of alterations made to the soundtrack, one of which I will go over later. As per every other episode of Top Gear, there were 3 semi-official names derived for the episode, although none of them are particularly inspiring. Motor Trend and BBC in the UK both discuss the act of the boys building their own electric car, whereas BBC America chooses to cut straight to the chase and names the episode after the car itself. Since I couldn't come up with anything inspiring either, I decided to ask the machine, and I must say, I think this name is brilliant and plays exactly into the show's habit of referencing old British movies, all the while without directly naming the car. Charge in this instance can also refer to the act of charging an electric car, which I think is perfect. Once again, the episode aired at 9 PM instead of Top Gear's usual 8 PM. The studio session took place on the 18th, 3 days after their last date in Birmingham, although they hadn't really had much of a chance to rest as they were now getting ready for the public unveiling of the Top Gear Automotive Art exhibition at TVR in Middlesbrough, which was due to open on Saturday the 21st. The episode opens with yet another look at the G-Wiz, a car that the Top Gear team had lost little love over in the years since its UK introduction, having been blown up and smashed a fair few times by this point. Costing £8,500, Jeremy Clarkson opens up the 114th episode of Top Gear by genuinely wondering why anyone, Kristin Scott Thomas included, would ever want one at a price point like that. He opines that if all you want in life is a battery-powered box, why not just build one yourself? The gauntlet is therefore set. Top Gear are going to build an electric car entirely of their own creation, and have chosen to sacrifice a 1993 TVR Chimaera for their unholy automotive concoction, as it was one of only 3 relatively modern cars that used a body-on-frame construction, the others being the classic Land Rover and the Ford Panther platform. This car had been previously owned until 2004 by Pistonheads member Kelly's Hero, who commented this factoid on both the forum and the relevant Top Gear blog post. The plan is to mate the chassis of this TVR to the running gear of an old 1970s Crompton milk float, and this work will be undertaken at the Top Gear Technology Centre in Didcot, with brief shots of the old Didcot A power station in the distance, itself a hallmark of 1970s England much like the milk float was, and is sadly no longer with us. Like the Romanian road trip from the week prior, it seems the show still had 1 or 2 standard definition cameras on standby. I say this because for several, usually brief shots during the first part of the challenge, the footage looks strangely blurry or low resolution, even in the highest quality rips. I believe this is because the team had started filming this challenge prior to or immediately after the BBC gave the show the green light to be filmed in HD, and Elektra likely didn't have enough F800s or similar models available on the day, resulting in some standard definition cameras having to be trotted out alongside the high definition ones. In typical Top Gear fashion, the construction of the electric car wasn't without incident, and Jeremy Clarkson retreated to a mood room for some design inspiration, whereas the other two, likely with the assistance of off-screen help, got to work. Eagle-eyed viewers might be able to spot this miniature dune buggy, which was used in Top Gear Live for the Stig stunt show. Photographs on the wall of Clarkson's mood room included most prominently the Fiat Multipla, Ferrari 360 Modena, a Furby, the actor Peter Bowles, a photograph of Tyra Banks at a Victoria's Secret show, a scuba diver and a turtle underneath Sipodon Island off the coast of Vietnam, the Riva Aquarama, BAE Systems Hawk, and the cast of Baywatch. Clarkson commented the car should have a moustache, and is even wearing one to that effect. Perhaps this was a trial run for the character of Jason Clarkson a couple of years later. Now outside the Technology Centre, as is usually the case when Top Gear use this location to film, there are some interesting cars worth pointing out. In addition to the Ford Escort Mexico, which seems to have sadly disappeared not long after this episode was filmed, and the GTM Libra, which is brought along as an example of a successful kit car, there's also a much-hated Vauxhall Vectra, a Porsche 968, and if you look really closely, a Lotus Esprit. This is because when it wasn't being used on TV, the garage belonged to a man named Steve Howard, who ran Euphoria Racing, for which an advertisement can be seen in this shot. Howard himself was no stranger to Top Gear, having undertaken the role as the show's secret car builder around 5 years earlier, a privilege which extended all the way through to the live shows, including the DIY-themed garden shed gimmick cars the trio raced with as part of their then ongoing tour. Sadly, Howard's story did not have a happy ending, as 7 years after officially shutting up shop in 2012, he'd be jailed for his role in a tax evasion scheme and sentenced to 15 months in prison. Finally, for those weird few who must ask questions about the most minute details, Ars Vogel Skip Hire was a locally based firm that was acquired by McCarthy Marland in August 2024. Its name was ultimately derived from the Afrikaans term for a vulture. Finally, after untold hours of hard work, it's time for the boys to reveal their creation to the world.
That is the worst looking car in the whole world. I'd rather look at one of your dingleberries.
All that's missing is a name, which Clarkson handily provides.
Geoff.
Now, it's likely that Clarkson picked the name of Geoff because that was also the name of one of his free rescue donkeys he adopted in early 2003. Geoff would sadly pass away shortly before Christmas 2006 at the age of 8, with his wife, Kristen Scott Donkey, passing away around 8 months later. On the flip side, it appears Eddie, named after Jeremy's father, was still alive as of autumn 2009, at the time the challenge was filmed, with the inaugural driving sequences known to have occurred on the 5th of October 2009. As the three push Geoff back into the Technology Centre, there's a small unintended visual gag that I think is worth pointing out, given a recurring theme that's seen throughout the episode. A spare door from the Brickcar 24-hour BMW reflects the sunlight from outside, revealing a rather humorous message. With building and all other prevarications well and truly over, it is time for the moment of truth.
I feel like the Pope with his head in a box.
Now, if you're watching the original BBC airing of this episode, the song used here was Tom Petty's iconic Running Down a Dream. However, if you own the Series 14 box set instead, you're treated to something a little more extreme. Now, commonly used stock track from a licensed library, it isn't too much of a surprise to hear the Hardy Boys theme every now and then, having previously appeared in pre-2024 Dave re-airings of Series 13 Episode 3 for instance, but it's always interesting to hear it outside of a pro wrestling context. Now on the road, Geoff seems to be working quite well, even if there are a few obvious flaws, the most pressing of which was probably deciding to have your bodywork done in shiny stainless steel without bothering to paint it. Eventually, the trio end up in Oxford, where the electric motors pack up and they get themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place. More specifically, they end up marooned on George Street, outside Caspian News, which is still operational as of 2025, and Garden Images, which went belly up in 2012 and has since been replaced by Byron's Gourmet Burger Restaurant. A group gathers as they perform quite possibly the slowest three-point turn in recorded history and are eventually back on their way. Now, because the trio were nearing the peak of their popularity by this point, there's quite a decent selection of amateur footage extant on the internet. What this footage reveals is that the path Geoff took on its maiden voyage was at least somewhat predetermined by the lead camera car, a metallic grey Range Rover. It appears that inquisitive fans and members of the public alike caused problems during filming and resulted in the team being escorted around by a couple of big, bold, burly fellows to ensure that the procession kept moving as smoothly as possible. Heading north through the A4165, Geoff conks out a second time not long after turning onto South Parade, a one-way street where the Mamma Mia Pizzeria and Sarah Wiseman Gallery overlook each other, a distinction they still hold more than 15 years on from broadcast. Another crowd gathers as Clarkson borrows some long electric cables from the neighbouring Portobello restaurant that they then connect Geoff to until the car has built up enough charge to leave. As they muck about, blocking the roads much to the delightful indignance of the Oxford locals and drawing an ever-growing crowd who can hardly quite believe what's happening and use the opportunity to snap some photos, the boys themselves are photobombed by a Ferrari 550 Maranello, likely belonging to one of the nearby businesses. Finally, the car gets going again and is able to leave the city of Oxford, but as night falls, Geoff breaks down a third time. In a potentially scripted moment, it's pushed into a field where it rather predictably rolls away and crashes quite heavily into some shrubbery, ending the first part of the film. We segue into the news, where the trio cover the upcoming rule changes for the 2010 Formula 1 season, including 4 new teams, even though one of these would become a motor racing cryptid and never got beyond the factory they bought. Of particular note to the 3 hosts is the Manor Racing team, based between Sheffield, Rotherham and Worksop, which results in some fun with Clarkson's original accent.
I'll tell you what, if that Fernando Alonso twats into our car, his Ferrari will be buggered. I'll tell you that. They're replacing Toyota and they've signed Emo Glock. And that's a national anthem. Well, I've been abide with me on a brass band, be lovely.
That carbon fibre, I made mine out of steel. Stainless.
The next topic covered in the news focuses on how apparently police forces in the UK will choose to adopt zero-emission vehicles such as the Mitsubishi IMEV, helping them to crack down on CO2. Although as far as I can tell, this never ended up happening for reasons that one shouldn't really have to think about for long. Scotland would eventually commission one unit on a trial basis, one that stuck with the force for admittedly quite a long time, as this photo from 2019 would indicate. But when your job is centred around catching criminals who may be in some high-powered machinery, a virtue-signalling statement towards the environment is the last thing you want to drive, and the scheme evidently never progressed beyond that. The next article is probably the one people tend to remember the most from Series 14, and that's James May's infamous fizzing sensation he feels at the root of his groin when behind the wheel of a fast car. He reiterates this concept as part of a deleted scene that was omitted from the NTSC box set, but was thankfully archived from the original Top Gear website thanks to YouTuber Megan T. This interjection is brought on due to Clarkson mentioning a study recently conducted in America which measured the testosterone level of 40 young men when they got behind the wheel of a Toyota Camry as opposed to when they got behind the wheel of a Porsche 911. The study itself was called The Effects of Conspicuous Consumption on Men's Testosterone Levels and was conducted by Gad Sard and JC Vongus of Concordia University. May chooses to debate with Clarkson for a bit over whether or not the feeling is real, then asks the audience if anyone feels the same way he does. Now, I should make it quite plain for those who prefer to suspend their disbelief that there were many times that the Top Gear hosts genuinely interacted with unwitting members of the audience in a completely unprompted manner, typically during the call wall as I've previously highlighted. This young man, however, was not one of those times. As you might expect, this wasn't just any random member of the general public, and was likely hired by the production team in advance simply to debate James May and provide some comic relief. The reason we know this person is a studio plant and not a legitimate ticket holder is because he is stated to have also made an appearance at the previous week's studio taping in order to rehearse the same skit a week in advance. Concluding the news, Clarkson talks about an item that is set to air the following week, and asks the audience who they believe to have made the highest number of great cars. A few suggestions are thrown around, and a poll is created on the Top Gear website for people to vote on, before we move on to the next film. Clarkson opens this next part of the episode by mentioning the Audi R8 he had driven the previous year, to which end Hammond has something to say.
But in a straight line at least, it was a little bit slower than a Porsche 911.
Yeah, quite a lot slower than that.
This is referring back to Series 10 Episode 2, where Clarkson and Hammond had a rare joint track test, pitting the Porsche 911 Carrera 2S against the previously unknown Audi R8, which ended in a drag race that Hammond won by a very small, albeit decisive margin.
It was about that much slower, and I admit that much makes all the difference.
The film itself is from the archives, one that hadn't managed to air during Series 13. Enter the Chevrolet Corvette versus Audi R8 track test, helmed by Jeremy Clarkson. You can especially tell this segment was filmed during the later standard definition era of Top Gear because the cameraman decided to stack on a bunch of filters to make the footage look like it came from a 2006 video game and contrasts greatly against the much more mildly filtered HD era films. The track test itself is nothing much to write home about other than the fact it reunited Clarkson with a car he had first driven during Series 12's Bonneville road trip. We begin with the Audi, a much more restrained take on a supercar which can get a little hairy if you want it to, but is otherwise very orderly even in the way it offers its factory options. Then we meet its competition from America. The Corvette is presented as a much more organic take on a supercar, loud, obnoxious, and frightening when you put the foot down. There's a rather tired old scene of Clarkson pushing madly at the rear bumper panel as though it's something only Corvettes do, when in actual fact basically any car built out of fiberglass would do the same, and the Corvette proceeds to thrash the R8 at a drag race. Around the test track, the Corvette is surprisingly able to keep up with the R8, albeit in a much more terrifying and uncontrolled manner. Clarkson's overall outlook towards the Corvette is oddly fond.
You'd have to be bonkers to buy the Corvette. And that is why you should.
I have an apology to make. I said in that film that the Audi's trip computer was broken. It turned out that I hadn't pressed the reset button properly.
We did actually ring Audi to confess to what he'd done, but it was too late. The man responsible had shot himself.
The two cars then have a go at power lap, during which the R8 is on a noticeably wetter track, although nonetheless still drier than what we'd see for the rest of the series. Once again, the track playing is the very same Chas and Dave medley from the week prior, although at a different point in the song. Quite surprisingly, although it did have a slight advantage on the track surface, the Corvette beat the Audi R8 by more than a second, with a 1 minute and 24 second lap time against the Audi's 1 minute and 21.6, which makes the Vette quicker than a Ferrari 599 or a McLaren Mercedes SLR.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Sheen!
Michael Sheen is the show's guest star this week, and the Port Talbot native proceeds to enthrall the audience with the many versatile roles he held when it came to acting. His car history isn't much to shout about, with only a red Ford Orion and pressure to adopt a hybrid in his new home of California, but he proves to be anything but a sedate driver in the Lassetti during his practice laps, as it would later be revealed on the Top Gear transmission blog that he'd break 2 cars. Thankfully, we don't just have to leave things to our imagination, as these antics would be revealed on the American DVD release, which begins with a bowel-voiding spin at the follow-through. During another attempt, Sheen runs extremely wide at Gambon, sending the Chevy hurtling through the air and landing hard on its front left tyre, causing a puncture. With HPK unsurprisingly out of commission, he's quickly switched into HPJ, where he has this frightening spin at Bacharach Bend towards the end of the lap. Pulling the car out of the ditch reveals that the backup car can no longer get into any sort of gear, as it is slowly wheeled back towards the hangar for repairs alongside its stricken brother. On his final timed lap, Sheen is no less vigorous, wrangling the car around Dunsfold with the aims of beating his fellow Welshmen, who languish around the 151 mark. As the only dry celebrity lap of the entire series, Sheen's lap is quick, and he ends up setting a 146, comfortably into the upper half of the board, and besting them to the tune of 5 whole seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Sheen!
The episode concludes with the second half of the Electric Car Challenge. The team go back to the drawing board and improve where Geoff failed, namely beefier batteries, a front bumper, some new wheels, and an experimental hybrid kinetic energy recovery system to prevent the batteries from cutting out when the car was in reverse or at a low speed. They give their creation a brand new name, rechristening it as the Hammerhead iEagle Thrust. Hammerhead as in the Hammerhead shark, with Clarkson pointing to a photo of bottlenose dolphins, Eagle and Thrust because of their positive masculine connotations, and the I part to indicate it's an electric gadget and therefore hip with the audience who would likely buy one.
After many days of development, our new, improved car was finally ready.
With this improved electric car, the team take it to Chimaera, the site of many previous Top Gear shenanigans, and put the car through a mock scrutinization process. The first and foremost of these is ensuring the Hammerhead is safe to use on public roads, and for that reason it needs to be crash tested. Since they aren't afforded the luxury of a real crash test dummy, it's a job they have to undertake themselves, and entrust each other with painting their faces. Since they don't want to destroy their new creation, they come up with some ingenious ways to make the car seem extremely safe, such as speeding up footage of the car slowly bumping into a wall, and reversing footage of the sideswipe bar, complete with a reverse twacool and backward sprinting to the undamaged Hammerhead.
Twacool! Wow!
After this comes a performance test in the form of a quarter-mile drag race against a third-generation Toyota Prius, a cyclist billed as Chris Hoy's neighbour, although in reality a member of the film crew, Hannah Young, the fastest person in the Top Gear office and perhaps better known as a researcher than a professional sprinter, and the one that really matters, the Reaver G-Wiz. The Hammerhead unsurprisingly loses to the Toyota, with the bicycle finishing second, but crucially beats the other two, proving itself as a versatile means of transportation. Richard Hammond gloats over his pseudo-victory in his typical manner.
Yeah! Oh yeah! Well, what do you think of that then? What are you, stupid little plastic gerbil?
Next up is the real acid test. Chimaera's fearsome Belgian Pavé road, which has provided the Top Gear team with a fair few laughs over the years. The Hammerhead copes surprisingly well for the most part, although its bodywork does get chewed up and crumpled, and perhaps more adversely, the diesel fume extractor pipe gets knocked out of place, hotboxing all three hosts with a healthy dose of carbon monoxide. After this is the dreaded slope test, and the Hammerhead unsurprisingly fails miserably at this, although given that the G-Wiz was seemingly never tested here either, James May is kind enough to give a fair and unbiased assessment of that car too, and to their complete shock, it's worse than their car. They put the car through a wind tunnel, only for it to reverse into the fans while Clarkson does what many think is among the show's greatest visual gags.
Where's Hammond?
Well, call him.
Right then lads, we're going to get on with this. Let's get going.
That works.
An extended outtake is also available on the American DVD box set. Finally, the Hammerhead's on-track performance needs to be assessed, and for this part of the challenge, they decide to hand the car over not to the Stig, but to the Stig's solar-powered, environmentally friendly cousin, Janet Stig Porter, named after British journalist and broadcasting personality Janet Street Porter, for those living outside the UK who might not know why this name was chosen. Sadly, despite the best efforts of this Stig, it passes away after inhaling a toxic amount of diesel fumes. Fun fact, this scene had to be shot twice, because a certain short presenter had recently purchased a Robinson R-44 helicopter and was rather over-eager to show his two closest friends his latest purchase. With his cousin now sadly deceased, it's up to the Stig to leave the car in the capable hands of a distinguished rival, who could impartially put the car through its paces. He gives the car over to Autocar magazine, and the episode ends with the three reading the review that was written about their car. Autocar would be fully in on the joke, and even provided a PDF file of the review for fans of the show who simply wanted to read Steve Sutcliffe's thoughts, which I've shown here. In true Autocar fashion, it has its own test number, 4,935.5, and instead of a road test, it's a rec test. I won't go over every intricate aspect of the review since it's entirely satirical, including a high-performance track test where it lapped 2 minutes slower than the Tesla Roadster, and wasn't even tried on a wet track out of fear it would likely have careened out of control. Hilariously, the I-Eagle Thrust is compared against 4 of its supposed nearest rivals and places third, ahead of a golf cart and the Reaver G-Wiz. What should be mentioned is that for many years following the episode's broadcast, this was the most popular image of the Hammerhead I-Eagle Thrust available on the internet. And if it looks different in a way you can't really describe, it's because you probably didn't see the image like this. You saw it like this. For some reason, someone decided to Photoshop these large silver rims on top of the actual wheels, and this edited version ultimately caught on. It is also worth mentioning that in the BBC America edit of the episode, Jeremy Clarkson's painted-on phallus during the crash test scene is pixelated out, although it seems that this cut of the episode is now extinct. The episode ends rather atypically, with the three putting the Autocar magazines down and walking off into the crowd, Hammond still noticeably with a limp. Critically, Series 14 Episode 2 was actually very controversial. one only needs to look at the forum threads on Pistonheads and Final Gear, as well as the archive comments on the old Top Gear website, to see just how polarizing this episode's content was at the time. Matters would be made worse and the pressure increased for Top Gear's production team when the Times began reporting that in spite of the program's best efforts to avoid conflict with X Factor, had lost a lot of their viewers, with Episode 2's provisional rating on BBC Two clocking in at a mere 6.19 million against Series 13's peak of 7.69 million, the show appearing to have lost over 1.5 million of its total audience. Barely a month or two after discussions had finally died down, the subject of Top Gear's potential future cancellation was once again on the mind of every publicity-hungry journalist looking for any reason at this point to discredit the program in the immediate wake of Stuart Lee's outburst. In the years since the episode's broadcast, the Hammerhead Eye-Eagle thrust quickly became one of the show's most well-loved creations, particularly by the far less critical younger fanbase. Replicas were soon drawn up in LEGO and SketchUp alike. It appears as an unofficial mod for more games than you can count, including a lore-friendly version for Grand Theft Auto 5. It has appeared in several pieces of Top Gear spin-off media, namely 2012's Stunt Score Evolution, 2014's Race the Stig, and 2015's Caravan Crush. It was licensed to CE Games for its short-lived although well-known Facebook game Car Town, and thanks to the model format being cracked after 2 whole decades, it even exists as a mod for Gran Turismo 2. It appears it also served as Mr. Musk's primary inspiration for when the time came for his firm to bring out their very own stainless steel electrified box, albeit with none of the soul that Geoff naturally had. As they always say, imitation is the sincerest form of flat battery. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, please consider becoming a subscriber or supporter, as your generous donations are what help to keep this channel going. Links to my Patreon and Ko-Fi are in the description. Thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.
Oh, my chest!